Ah, thanks for coming
Thanks.
on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Michael.
Pleasure. So, if you're listening to us live, one of our usual unannounced lives, we just like to keep it casual with that, so we don't put too much pressure on ourselves. We are talking today about really important topics for anyone who is either building up their business to sell or considering doing that one day. And that is the two topics are going to be how to get the best price for your FBA business and also selling to an Amazon aggregator versus a broker. What are the differences? Why should you bother with either of those routes? And even if you're not thinking of selling right now, I would say that from conversations in the mastermind, most people with a serious size private label or custom product business have it in mind at some point. And my suggestion is the way the markets are going, Thomas, you and I can have a talk about this from your expert view, get on with it because their valuations are pretty amazing right now from what I see, and I'm not sure that's going to last forever. We can discuss this. So if you are listening on the live with us, whether it's Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, wherever else we end up streaming these days, don't forget to ask some comments on the replay as well. And we probably won't have time to get to them. If we can, we'll answer them on the live. If not, we will circle back around, Thomas, or I will come back around and do our best to try and help you. And obviously, Thomas, incredibly expert in this field, so a great opportunity to get some input from somebody who totally knows their business. So, with that said, are you ready to plunge in and get this recorded?
Yeah, let's do it.
Excellent. I'm just double checking that we're actually going live. Looks like we are. Just double check on a Facebook group and then that'll be enough checking. We just get this done. Let me just check here. Is it behaving itself? Looks like it. Let's just double check. Yeah, looks like we're going. Excellent. All systems are go. So let's get into the show. Ladles and jelly spoons, boys and girls, welcome back to the 10K Collective podcast, the place to be for 6, 7, and 8-figure Amazon sellers, a subset of the Amazing FBA podcast family. Today, we are talking about a really important topic, which is how to get the best price for your FBA business. Lots of people are talking about selling their business, but actually, the nuts and bolts of it and the thinking on approach to it, so not just a few months before, but what you're actually building, all of that stuff has really got to be thought through in advance. So we've got a great expert with us today, Thomas Smale of FE International. Thomas is the founder and CEO. They've been in business since 2010, I believe, roughly, and
Great.
he's a serial business entrepreneur and M&A expert, and he's built a very substantial team there. They've had over 1,000 business sales. So they really know their stuff in this space, and that's really important because quite a few people have come into this space, M&A space, and about 3 minutes ago, it seems. So, Thomas, good to have somebody with some serious background behind them. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me on.
My pleasure. So, we've given a very quick intro about yourself. I guess we've probably got enough to know, but if there's anything else you think we should know that gives you, the expertise to talk about this, then what else we need to know about you and FE International?
Yeah, so we've been, as you mentioned, we've been in business about 11 years now. So I guess we predate anything FBA. I mean, Amazon's been around for a while, but we predate anyone building FBA businesses and selling them. So we work with a range of different businesses in the Amazon business and the Amazon space, and also outside of the industry as well. But we work with software companies, content-based businesses. So we have a lot that overlaps the Amazon world. It may well be we've sold software businesses which help Amazon sellers. We've sold Amazon stores. We've sold regular e-commerce businesses which don't necessarily sell on Amazon. We've sold content businesses which talk about Amazon. So have a lot of experience in the space. And I guess we've been around for longer than the aggregators. And like you said, a lot of the kind of newer brokers who have like popped up in the last couple of years. We have, I mean, the name is FE International, and I guess that's intentional. Like we have a team all over the world. So I'm English, but I'm based in San Francisco. We have a team in London. Our head office is now in New York. We also have a team in Miami. And over the last couple of years, I think like most companies, we started to build out a bit of a remote team as well. So across everything we do at the moment, we have about 110 people. In the M&A side of the business is about half of that. Like I said, primarily based in New York, London, and then a growing number of remote people. We're very much what we would describe as a full service M&A firm, so mergers and acquisitions. You could also describe it as a business broker on the lower end, but essentially we work with people from valuation, so establishing what their business is worth, all the way through to like finally executing a sale. And we work just with sellers. So sellers are the ones that pay us, sellers are our clients. And we go through the whole process with them, kind of handhold, negotiate, and do absolutely everything throughout that process. And you mentioned we've closed over 1,000 deals. It's just over $1 billion in total value. So we work with a real range of businesses. You could be making $1 million a year on Amazon. You could be making $50 million a year. Like we've seen it all, and we'll work with a range.
Wow. So that's that's certainly quite the impressive numbers. So the main thing we're going to talk about today is the value question. And so the main question is, what are the elements that drive value or price? And I guess we've got to keep in mind the audience of people who aren't ready to sell, which at any given point is a small percentage of even, 7-figure business owners, I guess, right? But let's think about it from the broader perspective of building value. And then eventually that shows up when you sell, right? What are those elements that build a value in a business?
Yeah. So, I mean, firstly, there are lots of factors that go into it. I think some people fall into the trap of oversimplifying it and saying, oh, what's the formula? There's no formula where you can just take X, multiply it by Y, and end up with a valuation. If it was that simple, then it just companies like us would not be in business. So we look at lots of different variables. I say probably some of the most important ones, like revenue and gross income, are important, and all the factors relating to that as well. So is revenue growing and is gross income growing? There's no point kind of revenue growing if you're then losing money because you're spending a lot on ads, which definitely happens on the Amazon platform. You can see businesses which top line are growing, but over time their return on ad spend is decreasing. So the top line might look good, but the bottom line, or at least gross profit, doesn't quite look so good.
So gross income, just to check, you mean gross profit, so profit after direct costs, cost of goods sold, etc.
Exactly. So under that definition, we would include ad spend. And then also net income, which is, I guess, the line below that by time you take into account fixed overheads. That's also important as well. So you can't just have growing revenue. You also need to have growing gross profit and also growing net profit, at least for like a high valuation. It doesn't mean your business is unsellable if not. I mean, a lot of the businesses we represent at FE International, I guess the time where people decide they're ready to sell is when the business is quite flat. So there's still buyers out there, but from a valuation perspective, you get a premium for a business is growing. I guess it kind of sounds obvious, but that's the way buyers will look at it. So those are probably the most important factors. I think a lot of people then, I've heard a lot of people talk about valuation. I think things that people don't really care about are things like, how many SKUs do you have? You don't get paid more for a business if you have 100 SKUs or 10 SKUs, or less if you have 1,000 or whatever that might be. As long as it makes sense for the business, then it's not going to affect the valuation. So there's no correct number. You might get told that by different people, or buyers might have criteria around the number of SKUs, but there's nothing like that. So you shouldn't be afraid to launch more products or discontinue products because you feel like you might have too many, because ultimately that really comes down to your business and the processes and the team. If you're building a team, like what they're working on and what they understand. Like if you have a good process for launching more SKUs, and some businesses will just need a lot of them, like maybe you have like different colors, different sizes, you can end up with essentially one central product that has 100 SKUs. So things like that really don't matter. Like ultimately, buyers care about growth. Buyers care about being able to take over the business. This is a little bit more subjective from a valuation perspective, but it's essentially like, what does your supply chain and logistics look like? Is the supplier your brother, or is the supplier kind of not someone anyone can go to, but is it a kind of a real relationship that's going to continue on an ongoing basis? Buyers then care about the fulfillment process. So some people are just using, I guess as the name suggests, fulfillment by Amazon. So they'll literally just be shipping it directly to Amazon. So most Amazon sellers we see will at least touch the product between the supplier and Amazon. So maybe they're packing it themselves, maybe they're doing some form of special packaging or inspecting the product or whatever that might be. So a lot of the businesses we see on the Amazon space have maybe a warehouse or a storage unit, maybe they even operate out there in garage, whatever it might be. So it doesn't, from a valuation perspective, it doesn't really matter which of those you have. The important part is, can it be taken over? If it's going to be hard to take over, that's going to hinder the valuation. If it's easy to take over, then that's not a problem. So we're currently in the middle of closing a deal at the moment, and the seller operates a business literally out of his own garage. The buyer is acquiring the business. He's going to be operating outside his garage. So this morning, before I got on this call, our team are in the process of literally booking a removal van to take all of the product from basically one side of America to the other. So the reality is, on paper, that sounds really messy, but the reality is that's how a lot of businesses work, and like moving stock around is kind of normal. Buyers understand they have to.
Yeah.
Buyers understand they have to do that. So having kind of reliable supply chain all the way from supply through to physically selling it on Amazon is important. The industry you're in does also, this is again, I think one of those things where there's sometimes a little bit of misinformation out there. The industry you're in doesn't really matter. Like some industries buyers will just not be comfortable with. So for example, supplements is probably quite a common one that we see. That might be like vitamin supplements or whatever it might be. Some acquirers just don't want to touch it at all. But that does not necessarily mean that the valuation is low or lower than a business where everybody likes it as an industry. So you also shouldn't worry too much about that. I think a lot of people hear that, oh, like supplements is a bad industry or a good industry, think that makes a difference. It really doesn't. There are some products that people might not like, as like a large group may not like, but I'd say generally, if it can be sold on Amazon in the first place, then it probably will not affect valuation. So yeah, like I said, there is a lot of misinformation about valuation, but ultimately buyers care about a business that's growing, a business that's profitable, or at least has a path to profitability, and a business that they can take over and reliably believe is going to continue like that. So there's a supply relationship, there's some form of logistics process from getting the product from the supplier to the end consumer via Amazon, and that's working well. And then I guess all the obvious stuff, which like, is your Amazon account in good standing? If not, what have you done to put in place to make sure that it will be? Because particularly almost every big Amazon account I've ever seen has some sort of have had issues with Amazon before, whether it's removing products or whether it's some form of warning. I mean, you know more about this stuff than me, but there's all sorts of different stuff they can.
Yeah, there are lots of ways Amazon can ding you. Yeah, and as you say, it's a bit like Amazon themselves. You can get reinstated from all sorts of things most of the time if you have a really intelligent, well thought through, well articulated plan of action, as they call it in the Amazon world. And I guess your buyers are looking for something similar, right? If you've done something that didn't work out, or you've annoyed your platform partner, then what have you got in place to minimize the chance of that happening again?
Yeah, exactly. It's not that it should never have happened, because buyers understand if you're building a business, it does not always go perfectly. That's almost like feels more genuine than a business that seems perfect, because that's never the case.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a perfect. I think entrepreneurs tend to cut corners a bit in the early stages, and that makes sense in the sense there's less to lose. But then, obviously, when buyers are doing their due diligence and looking under the carpet, they discover these things, and there's levels of it, right? And I noticed that the bigger the business that somebody has, the more sensibly they tend to behave, and that makes total sense to me as a risk reward sort of judgment. And I guess that sensible buyers are going to have that in place, and I guess a few buyers are going to just be scared about everything and probably won't buy anything anyway. Just a couple of reflections on that. Obviously, good correction to some of the stuff out there. It's not so much misinformation if a particular aggregator is quite big and putting a lot of information about their buying criteria. that is accurate as far as it goes, but it's only one entity's buying criteria. I guess what you're saying is there's a market out there for lots of different businesses. So if it's not growing but a bit flat, there are still buyers out there as long as you're realistic about valuation. Good point. Thank you for making that point, because some people, once you've got your baby, everyone's a bit blind about their baby, aren't they? And their children are one blind spot and their business is another. And the other thing you said that's interesting is that it doesn't matter how many SKUs you have. Now, my question around that, like I've spoken to a few aggregators and they want to plug a business into their own business. And obviously, if you've got 1,000 SKUs in order to produce, say, 200,000 in EBITDA or something versus 10, there's going to be a much bigger management overhead, I imagine, for the same sort of outcome. I mean, how do you approach that when you're trying to find buyers for a business?
Yeah, so I think firstly, like I said, buyers will have lots of different criteria. So I guess for aggregators specifically, who are not the only buyers out there, because as the name suggests, they're aggregating. They want it generally to be as simple as possible, and that part of their criteria is around simplicity. But in my mind, firstly, our job is to bring multiple buyers to the table. So it may be aggregators, but it will probably be other buyers as well. And there are lots of buyers out there who ultimately only really not only care, but their primary focus is the financial profile of the business. They will figure out how to run it if they like the numbers effectively. So the number of SKUs, I mean, like I said, it can be, if you just have an arbitrary number of SKUs that's important, it can massively oversimplify it. Because let's say I'm selling, I don't know, say mugs, for example, would be a good example. You could have like one product of mug, and then you could have like different colors, different designs. So you could easily end up with 100 SKUs from essentially exactly the same product, exactly the same supply chain. And there's lots of other, like if you're selling clothing, for example, we're representing a business at the moment. He literally just sells socks, but there's tons of different SKUs in there because there's different colors, different sizes, male, female, kids. So you straight away end up with like 150 SKUs, but he's still just selling a sock. So yes, there are a lot of particularly aggregators who care about the complexity, but if they buy, say, 100 businesses with 1,000 SKUs each, they're managing 100,000 SKUs. That's quite complex. If you're selling a business and let's say you have 1,000 SKUs to a private equity firm, and this is one of 3 Amazon businesses they have in their portfolio, and they're going to bring in a CEO to operate the business, or a general manager, or maybe they're going to bring it under their existing umbrella of companies they own, then it doesn't really matter. I guess the flip side of that is that doesn't literally just mean launch as many SKUs as you want. It doesn't matter. It does still have to make sense for the business. So if you're just selling 1,000 completely different products that don't really have any correlation with each other, and you're just selling it because you've managed to list it on your account, that's probably not really going to drive a huge amount of value. But if the SKUs make sense, like I said, like the different mug designs, different sock designs, or whatever it might be, it doesn't really matter. In that case, I think it can make a lot of sense. But yeah, don't be discouraged by certain buyers who might be louder than others who say that the number of SKUs is important. Because I've seen it in the past where people will hear that and then they'll turn off some of their lower selling SKUs and they'll say, well, I heard you can't have more than 100 or 50 or 10. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of different numbers that I have as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. But it does matter if you just have an unnecessarily large number, or the opposite can also be true. You could just have one SKU, and that could be quite risky because, as we just spoke about with Amazon, maybe they take your SKU offline for a genuine reason or a not so genuine reason, and then your whole business is challenging. Whereas if you have, I don't know, say at least 10 SKUs and they sell equally proportionate amount each and you lose one, you've only lost 10% of revenue versus 100%. So there's lots of different factors that go into it. Hence why I don't like to oversimplify, but while avoiding saying like, it depends. But I'd say in general, the number of SKUs you have doesn't matter as long as it makes sense for your business.
That does make sense to me. And one thing that strikes me is there's a big difference between cutting the number of SKUs down because of some artificial number you've heard from an aggregator on a podcast versus you have, I like your scenario, which never happens, is you got 10 SKUs, all of them doing roughly equal numbers in terms of revenue.
Yeah,
one of them
it sounds great.
The truth is it never, the truth is there's always that 80-20, isn't it? I mean, so I've had actually clients who went away and gratifyingly did what I suggested and do an 80/20 analysis, and lo and behold, it's normally more extreme than 80/20. Like one person had 300 SKUs on their platform, and like 10 of them did most of his sales, I think, and probably most of his profits. So what I would say is there's a bit of a difference between what you were saying about the, aggregators want 10 SKUs or 100 or whatever, and therefore I'm going to cut off my lowest selling 300 or whatever. That's the difference between that and starving your best sellers of stock because you insist on restocking stuff that stays in stock for 9 months or something. So I do think there's still a case, isn't there, for that, cutting out the lower sellers or the less profitable ones, because it's an internal asset allocation question, I would say, which is quite different from artificial
for sure. But what I always say with like just exit planning in general is like it should make logical sense. Like you should only exit plan the things you do to sell your business should be what you would do anyway. So in your example, it makes complete sense not to be selling 290 SKUs if they're loads of hassle and they're making up 1% of your sales. Then yes, you probably don't need to sell them. But the flip side is you don't need to stop selling SKUs because of what buyers say.
Yeah.
One thing I've learned over the years, over 1,000 deals, is there's no business we've ever represented which everyone likes, regardless of how much I like it or you like it or whoever. It doesn't matter. There'll always be problems with everything. So you should kind of avoid the noise and just do what's best for your business, because ultimately you know your business better than anyone else does. You can hire a coach, you can join a mastermind, whatever it might be. You can get advice from experts, but you still have to be the one making the decisions ultimately.
That makes sense. So now I like the phrase you said, very simple. Things you do to exit your business should be the same things you do anyway. A very good phrase. I would say, tell me your thoughts on this, that a flip side of that is, in order to run your business well anyway, you should prepare for sale. Is that true? And insofar as it's true, in what ways? Or is it not true?
I think yes and no. So if you asked me this question 10 years ago when I was young and thought I was really smart, I would have said that you do have to do it slightly differently. But because in theory, yes, there are things you should do to exit plan that will increase the value of your business. But I think my belief now, as I've got a bit older and I guess I've just seen a lot more, I feel like depending on the stage of your business, that does depend how much you should be thinking about the exit in mind. Because, for example, one of the things we would talk about is like building processes. So when someone comes in and acquires your business, you have, in the theoretical world, you have a nice written manual or videos or whatever it might be of like, hey, here's how I run my business. The reality is, like you said, early on in your business, people tend to cut corners because the hardest thing when you're starting out is making money. So I think in the early stages of your business, so I would say, and again, this is somewhat arbitrary, but I'd say up to your first $1 million in revenue, you probably shouldn't worry too much about all of that stuff, because a lot of the processes, when it's just you, maybe your husband and wife team, brother, sister, brother, whatever it might be. We see lots of like family teams or friends as teams. Like a lot of the processes will be in your head, but given the choice of, say, spending your weekend building out a new ad campaign or coming up with a new product or writing out your processes, in my mind, you should spend your time launching that new product, doing stuff that can drive revenue. So a lot of the things that are important to have prepared for a sale, I'm not suggesting you should do it last minute, but things like writing a manual probably is not that difficult. And also these things will change over time. What you're doing in year one of your business will almost definitely not be the same as year 3. I know at FE International, for example, we're not an Amazon business, but we have tons and tons of processes written out. Almost all the processes we have today are not the same as 3 years ago. So things like that, yes, theoretically, you should have processes written out, but opportunity cost of writing out processes versus making more money, you should always focus on making more money. Maybe I've spent a little bit too much time in America where it's like capitalist culture, but I generally think that's the case most of the time. Like, and money also just solves a lot of problems. Like if you're making more money, you can then hire somebody to write out processes for you. You don't necessarily have to do it yourself. So ultimately, if you can focus on that revenue growth and gross profit and net profit growth, that solves a lot of other potential problems versus just checking every single box on the theoretical exit planning list. That can be great, but that doesn't necessarily make your business worth substantially more versus the person who's just spent no time thinking about it at all and has doubled the size of their business while yours is somewhat flat while you're writing out processes. So
Yeah,
it's
it's interesting observation,
balancing
actually.
act.
Yeah. Sorry, going to step on you there. Yeah, it is something I've seen in the mastermind. We had a guy do a seven-figure exit recently, and he's not a very process kind of person. I think, to be fair, he's not exactly an example of how to do it, because he knew in January he was starting considering a sale, and probably hadn't sorted out quite a lot of paperwork. And he was probably, I suppose, it was two brands that were just over the $1 million sort of value mark, and or revenue, and probably in the end value as well. And so he was probably a little bit behind that curve, but I take the point that because he had focused on creating really desirable products with great listings, and he had a knack for picking markets well, and doing a lot of branding work and messaging well, that you're quite right, that had driven the business to the point where it was worth the sweat of sitting down with teams of people, going through everything with a fine-tooth comb, and running to catch up, because in the end the business was worth more, despite the fact that he was a little bit messy with his paperwork. And that's not untypical for entrepreneurs anyway, I think, is it? So talking of which, then let's say let's nuance this a bit then. So if you're below $1 million revenue, sort of ballpark or rule of thumb, focus on growing it, not preparing it. Great point. But presumably we should be maybe not obsessing about SOPs, which, as you say, the way you do it in the first year is probably something you should never write down, because it might get kicked off Amazon if anyone found out about it, right? So you're probably best to just kind of leave that in the history. But nevertheless, there must be some ways in which we can sort of prepare for a sellable business now, even if we're just nearing the $1 million revenue mark, without getting obsessive. Where's that middle ground where we prepare without getting distracted?
Yeah, so it definitely is. Like, I've definitely gone between the two extremes of like theoretical exit planning and like no exit planning. In the reality, you have to meet somewhere in the middle. So things like documentation is super important. And I just know myself, like every time I do my tax return, I'm like, oh, I wish I saved down these like forms or whatever it might be. So keeping documentation is super important. So anything related to financials, anything you've paid for, basically, anything, maybe you've got like angry letters from Amazon or suppliers, whatever it might be, you need to like save all this stuff. So any sort of documentation, anything, you maybe have like trademarks or copyrights, company registration documents, all those kind of things are important to like keep and make sure you keep track of. The biggest problem we see with, say, almost 100% of Amazon businesses we work with, regardless of the size, is financials. They tend to be a complete mess. Not that that's the technical term, but they're just generally quite messy. So yes, earlier in your business, and again, this is my point about running a business well, you kind of have to do this anyway, but a lot of people don't. But from a sellability perspective, you absolutely have to know your numbers. There's no compromise there. Do you need a 100-page written manual about how to run your business? No. Do your financials need to be clean? 100% yes. And if they're not, and if they're unknowns, you're ultimately not going to sell your business for as much, because buyers are just going to take the worst case scenario. If you're like, oh yeah, this cost was between like 1,000 and 10,000, but I can't prove it.
Yeah,
they're going to assume it was 10 or 10,000. So it's a little bit of a balance. I say documentation is super important. The earlier you get in the habits of kind of tracking your financials properly, tracking anything that happens in your business properly, the better. If you turn up 5 years into the business and like, oh yeah, now I'm gonna hire a bookkeeper and start doing accounting, it's gonna be a mess, and it's gonna be problematic. So say financials documentation is the most important. Beyond that, I don't think there's a huge amount that's like absolutely essential. I think more at a high level, in terms of if you're ever planning on selling a business, I always say to people, it's really important to figure out what you're actually trying to achieve, and then work backwards from there. And then that kind of determines my advice. So for example, if you want to sell your business for, I use dollars just because I'm in the US, most people in the industry tend to be US. Let's say you want to sell your business for $1 million or $10 million or $100,000. Those are completely different levels. So if you don't know exactly what you need to get there, then it might start changing your plan. So for example, if your business is currently worth $1 million and you want to get to $10 million, then the kind of things you might need to do to get from 1 million to 10, valuation might be quite different from, say, 1 million to 1.5. It's important to understand where you're trying to get to, because my advice would somewhat change. If it's like currently at a million, when it gets 10, you should really be focusing on revenue growth. You probably need to do something drastically different within your business to get to that 10 million level. If you want to go from 1 to say 1.2 million, then maybe it's time to start working on documentation. Those small things really do start making a difference. So I used an arbitrary number of $1 million in sales. But depending where you live in the world, you may not need $1 million. Or if you live in New York or San Francisco or London or wherever it might be, maybe you need more than that. And that's a very personal thing. And I guess I'm not a financial advisor, but that number has to be something that you're happy with. And you can work backwards from there. So I always have people like think about what they want to try and achieve. And then it helps to talk to a broker or an M&A advisor. I usually think at least a year before you want to sell, because even the best business will have things that need to be prepared. And we can tell you specifically what you need to do. You don't pay us anything until your business sells. So it's in our best interest to give you the best information possible. So it's worth having that conversation at least a year before, so you can start prepping. There's never any obligation to have that conversation. So say a year before and give you some specific things, but also have a think about your goal, because what might be a lot of money to me might not be a lot of money to you, and vice versa. So
Yeah.
it's important to be very personal. Again, no mastermind coach, course, banker, broker can tell you how much money is the right amount for you and your family. That's something you have to make your own decision on.
Absolutely. I mean, the best they could do is ask you a question and then suggest you go and talk to your accountant in many cases, or an independent financial advisor, or both, I guess, in the end, right? It's like, so why do you even want to exit your business? And the answer is often, I don't. And then, but the money looks really good. So, I've seen people saying, I really don't want to sell my business. And then I meet them a few months later. Well, we haven't been in the mastermind for a couple of months with each other. Oh, you sold. Oh, okay. So I've seen that one before. So I guess it's a quite an organic, subtle thing, isn't it? The actual buying decision, and the number is possibly a little bit more measurable by an accountant or an FE, but only slightly. I mean, how IFA, I should say, sorry. So how big a house do you really need? Need is a relative term, isn't it? Do you need to live in San Francisco? I live in Hampstead in New York, not in New York. I live in Hampstead in London, but it's the same kind of costs of, I don't know, Greenwich Village or the wrong bit of San Fran. Do I really need to live in London? Well, my wife does for her work. I don't. So those are very personal questions, right? That coming back to your simple point about financial records, just again, your really excellent, very simple point, I think is a very valid one. Do things that you were going to do anyway. Now, documentation is something you probably wouldn't do as early on the operation side. Very good point taken. But I think getting clean financials, if you don't have those in this kind of business, in an e-commerce business specifically, I don't think you can get away with that anyway. I think your business is bound to be less effective than you think it is if you don't know your numbers. Whether you're starting off a retail arbitrage with a few hundred SKUs and a few $100s a month, even then, you need to know your gross margins. I think otherwise, I don't think you can run the business. So
for sure, particularly as you scale and you want to start running things like paid ads. If you don't know your numbers, it's just a recipe for disaster. But I say a lot of people don't understand like the overheads and stuff like that as well. But
yes.
Most people understand things like return on ad spend, because Amazon kind of calculates it for you. It's like, okay, I spent $100 and I made $1,000 in revenue. And then a lot of people will be like, oh, I have a profitable business, without actually really thinking about the rest of the supply chain and operations that go into it. So
exactly, and I would be very, very careful. I mean, Amazon does actually. They used to use with ACoS, which is advertising cost of sales, which I'm not going to get into the detail of this, but yes, kind of yes and no. But the return on ad spend is BS, because what it means is revenue you get back on ad spend. That has nothing to do with whether you made a profit or not, and it's not in Amazon's interest to know. And they don't know what your cost price is, and you probably don't want to tell them. You don't want to help them to reverse engineer your products and private label it themselves. Although I think that's less of a threat to your business than giving all of your profit, like 100% of it, to Amazon in the form of ad spend. So I totally agree with you there. So there's just a plea to anyone listening. If you don't know your numbers, for goodness sake, please, for your own sanity, go and know your gross profit and then compare it to your ad spend. And you may well find that you are working for Amazon. There you go. Lecture over, but really important point. So we're going to talk in a bit about brokers versus aggregators, because there are some differences, or the difference between them, and how that might work. But for the moment, just to wrap this segment up so that people have got a chance to get and absorb what we're saying, just tell us quickly what services you offer people at FE International for Amazon business owners.
Yeah, sure. So, like I mentioned right at the start of the episode, we represent sellers. So the first thing we offer to absolutely everybody is a free evaluation. So you can reach out, go to our website, navigate to the seller website section, reach out to the team, like request evaluation. We'll put that together for free for you. So to my point about where you might be in your business, I can't tell you without going through that process. And you also probably will not know where you are. Go through that process, get a free evaluation. We'll tell you what's missing from your business if there's something missing. And then we can have a conversation from there about what a future exit might look like. But essentially, our service always starts with pre-evaluation. There's no obligation. There's no hidden costs. And then on the flip side, if you're a buyer and you want to acquire a business, we won't represent you, but we have businesses we're representing that you can see. And if you just want more content around the industry, we have a lot of that on our blog. We have white papers you can download, depending particularly what you're trying to learn.
Excellent. Yeah. So I imagine your blog, if you've been in business quite a few years, there must be lots and lots of sort of value buried in there. So it's probably worth a good poke around if you're serious about this area, I think. Well, look, I know we're going to talk about the aggregator versus, if that's a fair word, or aggregators and brokers and the differences and how that landscape looks in the next episode. But just to give people an absorbable chunk, we'll finish there. So, Thomas, thank you so much for sharing your insights on preparing to get the best price you can for your Amazon business. Really helpful stuff.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, so that's us out first. First episode done. So Thomas, are you good to keep going? Do you need a glass of water or anything? Or are we
I'm good. We'll keep the momentum rolling.
Keep rolling. Yeah, let's do this thing. Right, here we go. Ladles and Jelly Spoons, boys and girls, welcome back to the 10K Collective podcast, the place to be for 6, 7 and 8-figure Amazon private label custom product sellers. This is getting more and more detailed as I go because I'm always trying to make sure we reach out to, message to Market Match and all that. But today we are really focusing on those who are at least considering either one day or maybe quite soon selling an FBA business. And today we're talking with Thomas Smale from FE International. Thomas is the founder and CEO of the company. They've been in business, I think, 11 years now. Serial entrepreneur and M&A expert, and they've sold over 1,000 businesses. So he's seen an awful lot of business go across his desk, unlike quite a few of the players in the Amazon space who seem to have been come into existence like literally months ago. And I've spoken to a few of them, and they're very charming, and they may know some stuff, but they don't have that level of experience. So it's good to have somebody with experience. Thomas, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me back.
My pleasure. So today we're talking about selling to Amazon aggregators versus brokers. It's funny that the word aggregator's gone from something you might think had something to do with I don't know what, sounds vaguely like an agricultural implement, to everybody's talking about it. Everyone's creating one, it seems, every 5 minutes. So I think it's a really important discussion to not only have, but we've had that discussion before, but to refine and sort of think about the landscape as it develops. So first question is then, what's the difference between an Amazon aggregator versus an FBA business broker, if that's even the right word? And then there's the word M&A advisor as well. So how does that all pan out?
Yeah, so I mean, if you just look at like definitions, like I guess business broker, M&A, or mergers and acquisitions, essentially the same thing. Say in general, M&A firms like FE, for example, tend to work on slightly larger deals. Although we work on anything in the Amazon space, particularly generally like $1 million valuation up to over 100 million. So a real range in there. But generally most brokers or M&A firms will specialize on a certain size, certain industry. Just so happens we have quite a large team. We deal with quite a broad range of businesses. Aggregators, I guess, have almost like branded themselves as aggregators, but essentially they're what most people would call like a private equity firm. So they have private money, essentially, whether that's debt or equity, and they're using that to acquire businesses. And then the aggregator element is just the fact they are aggregating those businesses and running them all together. So very much like a traditional private equity structure that most people hear about. Most people are like, I always want to sell my business to a private equity firm or a strategic or a public company or whatever it might be. But Amazon aggregators are essentially just private equity firms that just or primarily buy Amazon businesses. I guess one of the primary differences is if you hire an M&A firm like FE International, we're a service, so we represent you and we will go find you a buyer and we will negotiate with traditional private equity firms, private companies, strategic buyers, individual buyers, aggregators, whatever it might be. I think there's a little bit of, say, misinformation, but I think a lot of people think that aggregators are the only one buying businesses. Yes, there are aggregators out there who have raised a lot of money, have access to a lot of capital, and are buying businesses. But private equity firms outside of that, who do not brand themselves as aggregators, also have billions and billions of dollars, and have done since the beginning of FE, so 11 years ago, before anyone even knew about buying Amazon businesses. There were still billions of dollars out there to acquire companies. That's not changed. I think the aggregators have just done a good job of branding themselves in an approachable way. So the primary difference is you hire us and we will go sell your business, and we will negotiate with various buyers. Will reach out to different buyers, whereas aggregators will buy your business off you themselves. They won't charge you any fees. They'll just buy it directly.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess that the obvious question that follows that is, okay, well, I could negotiate. And I guess that many of us have this kind of entrepreneurial idea that we can turn our hand to anything. And to a degree, it may be true, but I guess that the temptation is to think, well, I could negotiate with 10 aggregators if I can go out there. And I'm sure that a lot of people get an email a week from an aggregator. They've got a desirable looking business anyway at the moment, at least the people that I work with tend to, the clients I've got. And therefore, the temptation is, I don't need a broker. That's a waste of time. They're going to take my precious money. So this is the obvious thought. So as a broker, it's obviously a fairly loaded question, but we've got to deal with that. What's your response to that?
I mean, so firstly, you definitely can. The reason you hire a broker or an M&A firm is not because we're the only ones that can sell your business. It's because we have the experience and the leverage with other buyers that we can just get you more money on aggregate. So similar to hiring a good accountant or a good lawyer, like you don't, a good accountant should save you money. Yes, you might have to pay them a fee. Same with a good lawyer, you have to pay them, but they will save you money. Exactly same with us. Yes, on $1 million deal, for example, to use a very simple example, you'd be paying us 15%, which sounds like a lot, but even if you just take the maths involved and you completely ignore any of the service elements and you discount that down to a value of 0, if you can sell your business yourself to an aggregator for $1 million, and we would have got you, say, 1.3 million, even by the time you've paid us a fee, you're going to end out ahead. But there are lots of success stories out there from people who have sold directly, but they have no idea they've been told by the aggregator this is like the highest multiple they've ever paid, like, which is what they'll all tell you. All of the buyers will tell you, like, oh, this is a great offer. No one's ever going to pay more. Best deal we've ever offered anybody. And they'll successfully buy it. But because there's, I guess, a lack of transparency over kind of valuations within the industry, like we've closed over 1,100 deals now, over $1 billion in value. So we can leverage, negotiate, bring more buyers to the table. You might be able to find a list of 20, 50 aggregators yourself and reach out to them. But generally in any sort of M&A process, we're reaching out to thousands of buyers as part of that process. So at the very least, if you work with us and we sell your business, that there's realistically no other buyer out there in the world that would have paid more for your business. Whereas if you just send it to an aggregator, yes, they might buy your business, but you've missed out on 99% of the buying community that have not kind of branded themselves and positioned themselves as someone who buys a business directly. Because if you just think about their economics, if you're an aggregator and you have to go sponsor events, sponsor podcasts, sponsor communities, whatever it might be, you're literally spending money to buy businesses. So your economics have to make sense and work for you. If you're a more traditional private equity firm, they tend to stay, I guess, as the name suggests as well, like very private. And obviously it's called private equity because they're using private money, not because they're private, but they do also, like, you go on their website and it's just like 3 partners and they call themselves something capital, whatever it might be. You can't really find much out about them, but they have a lot of different companies there. They're usually spending literally 0 money on marketing. So they can generally pay more for a business because all they do is buy and improve businesses. Whereas aggregators have a huge amount of overhead just related to persuading people to sell their business to them directly. So while it may well be the case that we could run a process and the aggregator ends up being the highest bidder, so it's reasonably uncommon, but also they will have to pay more through us than they would do with a private deal. So you can definitely go chat to the aggregators. You just, I guess, you do not know what you do not know. So yes, you might have a successful sale, but what have you left on the table? In my experience, we can almost always negotiate a better deal than you can yourself.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I would just encourage people generally to go and speak to plenty of people before you decide who you're going to get into bed with. I mean, aggregators and brokers, really, because it's just an educational experience, right? You wouldn't try and sell on Amazon without, the famous thing, everyone goes and watches, listens to podcasts, including mine, I guess, and looks at YouTube videos and what have you. And the same with selling. I guess you got to educate yourself. But the difference is you really want to be dealing with experts, and conversations are going to be educational, but as you say, not jumping into bed with somebody immediately, probably. So then, talking of which, let's talk about the timescales. Presumably in aggregators, one of the selling propositions they have is very simple: we'll give you whatever it is, maybe a lower multiple, but quickly. Is that accurate, and how does that sort of stack up in your experience in the real world?
My experience is that's not really true. If your business is perfect, then maybe yes, but one of the big things we do, so I guess my very first answer to that is, if you're selling for, depending what your time is worth, but I'd say in almost all cases, in my simple example I used of, you can sell for $1 million yourself, and let's say you can get that money in a month, or you can sell through us, and let's say it takes 2.5 months, but you get 1.3 million. You're making, even by the time you take into fees, an extra $100,000 for an extra month and a half of time. For almost all people, it's worth doing an extra month and a half of work, and it's not even work that you're doing to get there. So one of the big things we do as part of our process is we spend 2 to 3 weeks on average auditing your business. So we literally have a team of accountants, and their job is to put your financials together. So if your business is absolutely perfect, you're going to get through a due diligence process without issues. But the reality is every single business has challenges. So we front load a lot of that work. So it might take us 3 weeks to do that audit work. And then we'll go run a bidding process. We'll reach out to a lot of buyers. We generally intentionally take, depending on the size and complexity of the business, it might be 2 to 4 weeks to get bids on the table. Yes, we can get you an offer literally on day one, but in most cases, the day one offer is not the best offer you're going to get. So if you just take an early offer, you're essentially losing leverage. So you run a bidding process. We got multiple buyers into the process, which does take a bit more time, but it's entirely intentional. If you want less money, you want to speed up the process, you can, but almost everyone we work with wants to maximize value. And then there's a due diligence process, which every single buyer has to go through. In almost all cases, once you've gone through our audit process, that will significantly increase the speed that a deal can get done, because all buyers have to do due diligence, whether they're aggregator or not. Like, they're using other people's money, whether it's borrowed, whether it's equity or whatever it might be. They have to follow a process. So yes, they might tell you they can close in 30 days, but if your financials are a mess, it can run. We've seen deals which run 6 months to a year, where someone's tried to sell themselves because the buyer has kind of made up various excuses as to why the deal needs to take longer, and they've just dragged it out. And similar to my point about valuation, sellers don't know what they don't know, and buyers are generally very charming and have the ability to explain to you why, in their mind at least, their delay is entirely kind of normal and intentional. So on paper, theoretically, a perfect deal with an aggregator could go faster, but just time value of money, the opportunity cost of what you're physically losing in dollars between a deal we'll negotiate you and one you can get yourself, is going to offset that time, even if it does happen faster. And in my experience, the vast majority of private deals end up going nowhere or just take forever. So on average, we'll definitely be faster.
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, it's kind of fielder's choice, as I think they say in this is the first time I've used an American sporting metaphor, so I may not be right with it. But in other words, as they say in baseball, you got to make your own decisions as a business owner. But if you're going to do this more than once, I guess if you've done this, if you've sold a business 3 times and you've got a bit of experience, you might actually get wise to the rhythms and the sort of ways of behaving and the sort of what people say versus what they do and all those kind of patterns that emerge. You get pretty savvy with buying your, on your 100th physical product deal. You're pretty savvy about that, right? And I guess the same is going to be true with business, but equally humility suggests that you get some expert help if you don't know what you're doing, I guess. The other thing I wanted to ask about was just really the types of buyers, because you mentioned that obviously aggregators are just one of many types of buying. You're saying, so you've laid out a bit of a stall of the aggregators, traditional PE companies that aren't busy marketing themselves, that have more money to spend, and they're not really, they're very literally private. Traditional buyers, strategic buyers. So just kind of give us a bit of a flavor of the differences of those types of buyers and how what they're looking for, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, there's a lot of overlap within those categories. So a strategic buyer, which everyone thinks they want to sell to, I guess, is anyone that has a strategic reason to buy your business. So maybe, I don't know, I used to work for an e-commerce business and I quit my job and I now want to buy a business. Strategically, it makes sense for me to buy an e-commerce or an Amazon brand. Therefore, on paper, I'm a strategic buyer. So I think the word strategic buyer gets thrown around quite a lot, but in reality, that's a person or company that has a strategic reason to buy your business. And almost all companies will check that box when they're buying your business. So an aggregator, for example, their strategic reason is they are aggregating businesses. Therefore, their strategy is they need to buy businesses. So it can get quite literal. I think most people think a strategic buyer is their biggest competitor. So in the example of my sock business, they're like, okay, well, I don't know, Primark or H&M or whatever, they sell socks. They're going to be the biggest strategic buyer that wants to buy me. The reality is big companies like that are almost never buying small Amazon brands or even medium-sized Amazon brands. So we definitely reach out to them as part of the process, but generally on Amazon businesses, generally not going to be the acquirer. We have closed deals with public companies in the past. So the kind of companies that are literally traded that you can go buy shares in, you might already have them in your portfolio. They are acquiring businesses. They're generally not just buying Amazon businesses. They're generally buying other kind of businesses we represent. But public companies are out there buying businesses. Strategics, like I said, that's a real range of different buyers. Private equity firms, again, could be an aggregator, might not be an aggregator. Anyone who's raised private capital, it's usually a combination of debt and equity. So they have some investors and then they borrowed some money from a bank, borrowed some money from investors. And generally the partners usually in the US, you describe it as the general partner. They're also putting some of their own personal capital in. So if you and I create a private equity firm, we put 100,000 in each, and then we go raise $10 million from kind of friends and family. Although I don't have any friends and family who have that kind of money, but we find some rich friends, they'll put their money in, we have $10 million, and then we call ourselves VZ Capital. We then have a private equity firm. So tons and tons of private equity firms out there with all sorts of different levels of qualifications, and I guess all sorts of different levels of cash. You could find a company that you look at their website and it doesn't really tell you anything. They might have $10 billion in committed capital and their partners know how to do deals. Or you might come across a really fancy website and they might have no money at all. So then there are a few other types of buyers. I mean, one is just like individuals. So anyone that wants to buy a business, generally buying businesses below $5 million in valuation. Can be buying above that, but I'd say it's uncommon. Usually if you're buying above that, you're buying through a company or you're already established in some way. There are other types of buyers we generally don't work with at all. Probably one of the biggest problem buyers of my example of deals that run on for 12 months or never happen, what you describe as a search fund. So search fund is, I guess, like a private equity firm, but they don't actually have any money and they have no commitments. So they go find a business and they put on a fancy shirt or a fancy jacket like you have on, and then they say they found a business, and then they go try find money. So it's VC capital without the rich friends and family. So the reason they take so long is they turn up with a fancy jacket or whatever, agree a deal, and they're like, yes, I'm going to buy your business $5 million. And their offer will usually be way above market because that's the only way they can get deals done. Sellers agree to the deal, and then they go try find the money. And it can often take forever or just never happen. So we get a lot of clients who come to us and say, hey, we've been talking to this buyer for 18 months. They said they're going to buy the business, but it's never closed. So I guess technically they are a valid type of buyer because some businesses close through search funds, just not that common. I would say overall, that's pretty much all of the buyers. Like I said, almost all categories overlap to some extent, strategic, financial, whatever it might be. But they're probably the main categories.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. And the search fund, I really like the idea of VC capital, although or maybe I'm coming across as some sort of shyster search fund dude because of the jacket looking a bit too sharp or something, which makes a change. I'm sure
It is a nice jacket.
Looking too organized and too smart is probably not my common sort of default mode. I try to make the effort for the podcast, but that's an interesting point that, joking aside, that a fancy website or a nice appearance or, charming manner doesn't really, matter. What matters is the funding, I guess. And then what are the other factors in somebody this is where you probably do need a broker or somebody to explain it, but what are the other factors that you would look for in a buyer apart from having the money, which is kind of basic? You talked about strategic buyer, but it's not necessarily a bigger deal as people point out, so thank you for the reality check there. What are the characteristics of desirable buyers apart from obviously the appearance?
Yes, we look at a lot. A lot of it's quite subjective because a lot of it depends what the seller wants. Some people just want literally as much money as possible, and they don't really care if they like or don't like the buyer. The reality is most people selling, when they start a process, they think they just want the most amount of money possible, which is our job, but it's also our job to balance kind of best deal in terms of dollars or pounds or whatever currency you're using, but also the best fit buyer. Because you want a buyer, ultimately, even if you're getting 100% cash for your business, you want a buyer who's going to do a good job with it. Most people think they're not going to care. It doesn't really matter. But ultimately, like you say, people like their business and people like their children. They're emotionally attached to it. People want to see their business doing well. So there are some subjective factors. So firstly, does the seller like the buyer? There's no right or wrong answer to that. I'd say in most cases, people get a vibe within the first 15 minutes on the phone, whether they like someone or whether they don't. Doesn't mean you can't sell your business to someone you don't like. And often, particularly, I like a lot of the aggregators. I know a lot of them. But generally, the people they have in like their M&A team, their deal team, are charming people, and you're going to like them. But they're ultimately not the ones actually running a business once they acquire the business. They have an operations team. So you have to like the buyer. Some people hate the idea of aggregators. Some people love it. Some people hate the idea of private equity. Some people love it. Same with individual buyers. Some people hate the idea of selling to an individual because generally they're going to need a little bit more help and a bit more of a handover. But also they can sometimes be some of the best buyers. So yeah, likability. Do you like them? Things we look at, like, have they done deals before? To my search fund example, anyone can find a business. Actually, then closing a deal as a buyer is much harder than it sounds. And as a seller as well. Like, for your first deal is definitely the hardest. We've done it over 1,100 times, and I still learn things every time we close a deal. There's always new things that come up, but first deal is definitely the hardest. So have they done a deal before? Generally, not that we necessarily have a hierarchy. We don't have like a strict process around this, but generally we would put a buyer who's completed a deal before ahead of one who hasn't, all other variables being equal, because it just reduces the risk. This kind of falls into the likability, but like, what kind of experience they have. Have they run an e-commerce business before, an Amazon business? Do you think they're going to run the business into the ground? Again, to the likability point, are you going to actually want to work with them if there's a problem? Are they going to get through due diligence? Do you think they're the type of personality that's going to renegotiate last minute, which happens all the time in private deals? Less so through an M&A firm like us, because we tell them politely, obviously, like where to go. So those kind of deals don't happen. Do they actually have capital? Like that's one of the big, we always ask for proof of funds. So you have to prove you have the money before you can start the process. Just simply having like a press release saying we've raised $50 million doesn't actually mean you have $50 million ready to go. Often they still have to go through an investment committee, or they might be, to my example of like VZ Capital, fancy website, fancy suit, fancy press release, but it doesn't necessarily mean they physically have the cash. So
I'm glad
it's
you're not
always
working
worth,
on my marketing team here, but
yeah,
yeah, joking apart, I think you make a very valid point that actually, again, that there's something almost aggressive if I'm actually the seller of the business saying, yeah, so Thomas, send me your bank account and I'll believe you, versus some intermediary doing it who does it as a very standardized process as well. That
yeah.
strikes
So
me that the relationship is a bit different there, isn't it, as well?
for sure, because sometimes we get people who will act insulted and they're like, "Oh no, I'm not sending you a bank account," and we say, "Okay, well you're not buying the business." So a lot of sellers in that situation will be like, "Oh, okay, actually, well you have a fancy suit, you have a fancy website. I'm just going to believe you." When they push back and they say it's absolutely not normal to provide my financial information to do a deal. So we deal with it because internally my team will sometimes try to get it past me. They'll be like, "Oh, Thomas, yeah, they said they have the money, but they don't have access to their bank account at the moment, so they can't send the bank statement." And we just say no. So also
That sounds so dodgy when you put it like that. They don't have access at the moment. It's like
yeah, they're
I'd
like,
be
oh, they're
like, fine,
traveling or
call me
whatever.
back next week when your bank's website isn't down. Then I mean,
Yeah,
that
we've
wouldn't be.
heard all of the excuses.
I can imagine. Yeah.
But yeah, so like they have to have the capital, or at least might not always be in the form of a bank statement. Like don't always have $50 million sat in a savings account earning 0.01% interest. But maybe some form of commitment letter. Again, this is why you hire us, because there's all sorts of different sneaky things people do to pretend they have money when they don't, because they want to lock it down and then go find the money.
Yes, if that makes sense.
I'd say
And
that
there is
they're
a
really
logic in that as well. I can see
yeah,
why that danger would exist because there's a logic from the aggregator or private equity or whoever, search fund, whatever they're calling themselves. There's a
for
logic in
sure.
getting you locked in and then you have your business off the market and they're off, they've got something concrete for which to raise money. So it makes sense that it's in their interest and not yours. So yeah, I can see why it would exist. Yeah.
Exactly. I'd say they're really the main factors. I mean, there are other things we look at as well, like do you like the deal terms and stuff like that? But that's again somewhat subjective. Some people will accept less cash for a faster deal. Some people they don't care how long they wait. They just want as much money as possible because of taxes or whatever it might be. Yeah, so I'd say they're the main things. But ultimately, it often is literally just as simple as how much do you like them, and likability has many different things that people consider. Some people care about some things, other people don't.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying. What strikes me very forcibly about this process, there are lots of numbers and lots of legal documents. There's a lot of very precise stuff. And yet, the very decision to sell, it strikes me as a very emotional and kind of somewhat irrational. It's a bit like, why do you buy the house that you want to bring your kids up in? Well, I guess because you like it. And at the end, there is something about that process that it's really struck me in having been sort of on the edges of a few of these deals now. And it's quite subjective, and we have to allow for that. We have to account for that and not pretend that we're going to be super objective, right? And also, I think trust feels it's not quite the same as likability, but it feels like what you're describing to me sounds like, are they trustworthy as a business partner, not as a general individual, but have they got the money they say they have? Are they going to run to the timescale they say they will? Are they going to, do they actually have the experience they claim and so forth? So that's would be my sort of simplistic take on it. There is sort of human characteristics as you're flagging up, and I guess a broker, it strikes me, has to have that blend of, as you obviously have, that savvy but also human element. It's about relationships at the end of the day, and also some places where you have a hard line of proof that you want, and knowing that difference strikes me as much as art as a science, really.
Yeah,
So,
it's very much a balancing act. I mean, sometimes just the fact that we exist in the middle is helpful. Because I always say to my team, sometimes they're like, "Oh, it's a bit embarrassing because the seller like did something wrong and it makes us look stupid." But if anything, I always say to the team, I'm like, "Well, if we look stupid and the seller does not, that's a good thing because we're representing the seller." And also, just from an emotional perspective, we deal with understandably a lot of buyers and sellers on both sides of the table. who get quite emotional. They can get quite angry. Some people shout, some people cry, like all sorts of completely human reactions. But because we're in the middle, it's fine. Like the buyer who's shouting down the phone because something is wrong, they're just dealing with our team. The seller doesn't necessarily have to deal with that, because if that deal happened privately, deals would just fall apart. So just having a middleman, I mean, it's like there are all sorts of industries where having someone in the middle makes sense. And it's exactly the same here. So literally just the existence of us can just improve the process, because we're going to be more objective. Like, I care about closing your deal, but I do not have any emotional ties to your business. But at the same time, I am a founder myself, so like I completely get it. But you're right, it's a mix of art and science. The accountants in my team will tell you it's more science. I'm more of a less of an accountant. I tell you it's more art. So it's definitely a mix.
Blend of the two. Well, look, you clearly have a ton of experience to offer. So I know that if people want to get a free valuation, they can go to feinternational.com. If you mention the Amazing FBA podcast, hopefully then they'll take care of you extra special. And anything else you want to tell us about that sort of business valuation call, or sort of initial call?
No, I think the one thing I would say is, like, it's never too early to reach out. I'd say we want you to at least be making some money, but you don't necessarily have to be ready to sell. It's better to be considering it in future. Because like we spoke about on a previous episode, you might be at $1 million valuation today and you want to get to 10 million, or you might be at 1 and you want to get to 1.2. What we're going to tell you is going to be completely different based on your goal. Or you also might start adjusting your goal. A lot of people come to us with a goal, and then I know, for example, in my business, when I first started my business, the goal I had for revenue, we surpassed that a very long time ago. And I was convinced that when I hit that level, I would like never have to work again or never do anything again. But here I am 11 years in, working harder than ever. And we're way past that level. So goals can change. So we understand that, like, we've been through it very many times. Don't be afraid to reach out. The only thing I would ask some people is just be honest. So don't pretend you want to sell, but actually not. Just reach out, say, hey, I listened to the podcast. Kind of like this Thomas guy, he had a nice shirt, and they were talking about like credibility of buyers. I wanted to get like an understanding of the process. Do that, and the team will be like happy to chat with you. Like I said, there's no obligation, there's no hidden fees, you don't get sent an invoice for anything like that. You only pay us if you decide to engage us and we physically sell your business. So reach out, don't be afraid. And if you don't want to speak to us for whatever reason, we have loads of content you can read, or listen to this podcast again, listen to episode 1 of this podcast. And I know you've got tons of other episodes that don't have me in it that are useful as well. There's loads of good information out there for you to learn.
Absolutely. And you guys have been in business for ages, so I know your blog has got lots of useful content on it. I was having a browse of that early today. So very, very good content there as well if you're wanting to educate yourself. And, the more you learn, the more you earn, as an old sales manager of mine used to say. I think it's just a space where being educated enough is critical, but also being humble enough to know you're not going to learn it all in one day, and trying to talk to the experts, always a wise idea. So Thomas, great pleasure to talk to you. A lot of useful, for me, new stuff, particularly about the characteristics of buyers, and the people you kind of want to avoid, and the characteristics of people that you might want to do business with, and the reality check on the subjectivity of the process. Really, really interesting stuff. Hopefully very valuable to everyone listening. So just remains for me to say many thanks for coming on our show today.
Well, yeah, thanks again for inviting me.
My pleasure. Okay, folks, that's the podcast recorded. So if you're listening to us live or on the replay, once again, Thomas is obviously a bona fide expert in this area, as we can all tell by now if you're still listening. So do pop in any questions or comments you've got. Questions would be wise. You're free to comment and vent about aggregators or whatever it is that you've got at the top of you've got to get off your chest. But I would suggest intelligent questions. It's a great opportunity to pick the brains of an expert. So that would be my suggestion. Thank you very much again, Thomas, for coming on live with us. We're going to end the live stream here. Thank you very much for